Hey, all you literary legends and luminaries. I'm Julie, and welcome to another episode of Booksmart. Today, we're going deep with a book that will change the way you think about the consequences of historical events on a personal level. It's Richard Flanagan's Question 7. This book is best described as a memoir that delivers a historical lesson. This is what sold me on the book jacket, and I quote, Question 7 is about the choices we make about love and the chain reaction that follows. I could not put the book down once I started reading because it was so powerful. Before I begin anything about the book, you might be wondering what Question 7 is. I was. It's not abundantly clear at the start of the book, but is found on page 24. And so here's what Question 7 is. So Chekhov's earliest stories was a parody of mental arithmetic questions asked of school children, of which Chekhov's Question 7 is typical. Wednesday, June 17, 1881, a train had to leave Station A at 3 a.m. in order to reach Station B at 11 p.m. Just as the train was about to depart, however, an order came that the train had to reach Station B by 7 p.m. Who loves longer, a man or a woman? Who? You, me, a Hiroshima resident, or a slave laborer? And why do we do what we do to each other? That's Question 7. Who loves longer? Though written for money at the very start of his career, Question 7 is in many ways the archetypal Chekhov story in just 2 sentences. Like so much of what Chekhov wrote, Question 7 is about how the world from which we presume to derive meaning and purpose is not the true world. It is a surface world, a superficial world, a frozen world of appearances, beneath which an entirely different world surges as if a wild river that at any moment might drown us. A woman ignored at dinner tables, a chorus girl betrayed, a man who deludes himself he is happier in the country, a womanizer who pretends to himself that he is not falling in love, a grieving cabman who tries to tell each of his fares his son has just died only to be ignored, and who ends up finding the only one who has time to listen is his horse. So much falsity beneath which we discover only in the last paragraphs, or sometimes even the last sentence, the truth of these people and through them of life itself. Virtue and morality are stripped away to reveal cruelty and wickedness, while cruelty and wickedness, in turn, are stripped away to reveal kindness and goodness. As in life, we are shocked. There is something sacrilegious about Chekhov, something shocking in his gentle, unassuming stories, so seemingly plain that finally refuse to accept the logic of this world and always surprise us by revealing another world that we recognize as the real world in which we live. Who loves longer? Chekhov's genius lay in never presuming to give the answer. So, Chekhov's Question 7 is mocking math questions, yet asks a fundamental question. Who loves longer? It's this question that Flanagan focuses on. Who loves longer? And those layers of life underneath that surface world. Be prepared. Flanagan's writing style is a bit abstract at times, lyrical, and not always direct in where he's heading. That's partly what made the book so suspenseful. I kept wondering where he was headed. Ultimately, this is what unravels in the beginning. Flanagan is Australian. During World War II, his father is a POW and ends up a slave laborer in Japan. Were it not for the atomic bomb that the U.S. drops on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, his father would have been killed, and Flanagan would have never been born. So I have to pause here for a second to tell a bit of my own story here. My grandfather was drafted for World War II. This is him. He did not want to go to war. He ended up fighting in the Pacific. Had we not dropped the atomic bomb, my grandpa was headed to mainland Japan, where he probably would have died. My mother was adopted, so she still would have been born, but my grandparents obviously would have never been able to adopt her. Where would she have ended up? Her biological mother was a teen mom, a travesty in the 1950s. It's doubtful my parents would have met, meaning I would have never been born. What Flanagan wrote about was something I often thought about starting when I was 17 when I did a paper on my grandpa in high school. I always thought we should have never dropped the atomic bomb, and I still don't think we should have. However, had we not, there's a high probability my grandpa wouldn't have survived the war, something he made clear when I interviewed him for my paper. And this was a tough interview for my grandpa. He never talked about his experience in the war. At 17 years old, I didn't know what to think anymore after he told his story, or at least the parts he was willing to share. Suddenly, history wasn't so clear to me anymore. My moral high ground was tempered by a personal perspective of someone who lived through it, as opposed to a historical event that was simply reduced to a couple pages in a history textbook. What Flanagan does in question 7 is challenge such simplistic views of history of the textbook version we are taught. Once Flanagan introduces his father's story, he then switches to H.G. Wells, the author of War of the Worlds, who falls in love with Rebecca West. Here's a good summary of the importance of that relationship, because you may not think it was all that significant, but it was. All that is known is this: in front of his bookcase, while talking about matters of literary style, they kissed. That kiss would in turn beget death, which would in turn beget me and the circumstances of my life that led to the book you now hold, a chain reaction which began over a century ago, and all of which will lead to the unlikely figure of my father, unlikely in that he is to appear in a story with, among others unknown to him, H.G. Wells and Rebecca West. In front of the bookcase, they now pause and stare for a moment at each other. They smell each other, he of walnut, she of lavender. Both sense that she would come to associate with the inexorable longing and an incommunicable anger. Their later accounts of this seminal event confused much, but were certain of one thing: it was mutual. They both took what they wanted. Perhaps it was her. Perhaps it was him. Perhaps it is what remains when memory and obliteration collide: imagination. Perhaps it just was, inexplicable to both. Perhaps it was question 7. This event is then the catalyst for the atomic bomb, the bomb that essentially saves his father's life. So let me summarize essentially what is in the bulk of the book, not for the sake of spoilers, but so you can see what Flanagan covers, because this is the whole premise of Flanagan's memoir, and it's towards the end of the book. We cannot be what we cannot dream. And sometimes we discover that we live in the dreams and nightmares of others, and we dream anew. I only write this book that you are now reading no more than a love note to my parents in my island home, a world that has vanished because over a century ago, another writer wrote a book that decades later seized another mind with such force that it became a reality that reshaped the world. It was a story of horror that was his fear of love, complete love without measure or boundary, and he created it in its place, an idea of destruction without limit. In this way, the world begat a book that would in turn beget the world. Without Rebecca West's kiss, H.G. Wells would not have run off to Switzerland to write a book in which everything burns. And without H.G. Wells' book, Leo Szilard would never have conceived of a nuclear chain reaction. And without conceiving of a nuclear chain reaction, he would have never grown terrified. And without growing terrified, Leo Szilard would never have persuaded Einstein to lobby Roosevelt. And without Einstein lobbying Roosevelt, there would have been no Manhattan Project, and without the Manhattan Project, there was no lever at 8:15 a.m. on the 6th of August, 1945, for Thomas Farabee to release 31,000 feet over Hiroshima. There is no bomb on Hiroshima and no bomb on Nagasaki, and 100,000 people or 160,000 people or 200,000 people live and my father dies. Poetry may make nothing happen, but a novel destroyed Hiroshima, and without Hiroshima, there is no me. And these words erase themselves and me with them. So take that in for a second and always remember the power of the book. What Flanagan has done is weave this historical story into that of his own. He writes of his father and his mother, memories that are written beautifully, and not all memories are ones that you want to remember. He retraces his father's steps, even interviewing a satanic guard that probably beat his father. Then Flanagan will switch back to the historical aspects. Some ideas are repeated often, like the actual dropping of Little Boy, the bomb that annihilated Hiroshima. Then Flanagan weaves in Aboriginal history of Tasmania, connecting such culture to his own personal story. And finally, he writes of his near-death experience when he almost drowned, an incident he brings up at the beginning of the book, but saves until the end to tell his readers. I know it sounds like a lot in such a short book, especially when the chapters are short and the font isn't teeny tiny. So a lot is covered in not a lot of space. Yet, Flanagan's writing is poetic, stating much by writing little. He leaves the reader to connect all the dots, to think more on the issues he writes about. Flanagan trusts that the reader will do so, that the reader will get it, which to me was one of the most powerful aspects of his writing. Some memoirs seem to over-explain, as if they insist on their reader following a very specified path. Other memoirs try to be abstract, and you're left wondering what in the world was the point of it all. Flanagan has balanced such extremes by giving the reader short yet intense scenes, with each one fitting into the bigger puzzle of his question 7 that he has posed for his readers. There might be many nuanced ways to interpret the book, but I don't think Flanagan would be upset with such interpretations. I feel this is one of those books that's supposed to leave you thinking. It's supposed to make us question the chance meetings we have every day and how those relationships, love in Flanagan's case, can alter not just our own personal lives, but in the scope and sequence of history. It's like the butterfly effect, which I totally believe in, how small things can lead to catastrophic events. In the case of question 7, the atomic bomb, and how over 150,000 to 200,000 people died, many instantly, which then altered the course of so many other lives. Even though I already knew much about the atomic bomb in World War II, I still learned a lot from Flanagan's book. I loved his approach, how the development of such a bomb stemmed from a romance, which then led to a story, which a scientist read and became inspired, but then worried about the catastrophic consequences of such a bomb, which were ignored when he put those in writing, and then we actually used the bomb, which then leads to so many other tragic outcomes. Question 7 is one of those books that I wonder why it isn't picked for Oprah's book club. When I compare it with the likes of The Many Lives of Mama Love, which I did a Booksmart episode on a little while ago, there's just no comparison. Sure, a book like The Many Lives of Mama Love is a relatively good read. It's an interesting story, but there isn't much literary merit in it. It's a straightforward story that doesn't leave a reader pondering too much. Sure, there's redemption in it, but there's also a nepotistic connection that sort of ruins some of the redemptive qualities. Yet Flanagan's book is one of those you wish more people would read. Not only would they learn valuable lessons in history, because we know people's knowledge of history is really, really poor, but it makes you think about your own existence and the power of a book. Don't forget that. It was that book that inspired someone else to do something, and after many somethings, we ended up with the likes of an atomic bomb. Question 7 will make you aware of philosophical ideas that you may never have considered before. I know I say this often on Booksmart, but isn't that the point of books? To make us think. And the other point of books is to give us inspiration. Even if you may not agree with the premise, even if you 100% agree with something like the atomic bomb, question 7 will still make you think about that decision. It's that awareness and perspective that we gain from such books like question 7. You have to read question 7. This is one of those books I feel I need to read again, that I will pick up ideas that I missed the first time through, that I could write my own grandpa's story and my parents' love story with a different depth. Flanagan has inspired me to look more deeply at life stories. So who does love longer? We'll never know, but we do know that those loves can alter history, which then affects where we are right now in our own existence. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.